If The Witcher 3 set some new kind of gold standard for what a AAA game should be in terms of size and amount of content, then Blood and Wine goes ahead and does the same thing for what a piece of DLC should be. This expansion has a huge amount of new things to do, making it great value for money. If all you wanted was more of The Witcher 3, or if you were disappointed that Hearts of Stone didn't include a new zone or much content outside its main story, then Blood and Wine acts as a perfect remedy. By providing a larger adventure that's full of side content, Blood and Wine complements Heart of Stone by making up for the few areas the previous DLC lacked. However, expectations are a double-edged sword. Hearts of Stone delivered a very well-written story that's shorter length and more focused approach made it stand out as one of the best pieces of storytelling in the entire series. If you expected the same from Blood and Wine, you might be let down, because the main story this time around, while entertaining, doesn't reach as great heights as that of Hearts of Stone, and has some far more noticeable problems. Nevertheless, there is a lot that Blood and Wine has to offer, with great quests, memorable characters, some easy to appreciate smaller additions, and of course, the joy that is Toussaint itself. A setting that both looks and feels magical, offering an incredibly well realised area to adventure in that contrasts to the bleaker areas of the main game and gives Blood and Wine its own feeling that works perfectly with making this a great send-off to The Witcher 3, Geralt, and you the player. There is a lot to say about Blood and Wine, but before proceeding any further, be aware that this video will contain spoilers. The amount of content added by Blood and Wine is impressive enough that it's easy to forgive the overall lack of evolution, but it should still be acknowledged. For the most part, this expansion plays it safe and sticks to what worked in The Witcher 3. There isn't a large amount of experimentation, particularly with points of interest and quest design, and anything you disliked about the base game probably remains in Blood and Wine. There are some small changes, but for the most part they really are small. Take the multi-part quests that are designed to encourage the player to visit points of interest, like the quests A Night for Hire, Wine Wars, or Big Feet to Fill. The idea behind them makes sense. If points of interest don't provide much rewards on their own, then why not link their completion to a quest so players have more incentive to complete them? However, this doesn't change the fact that those same points of interest are a bit boring in their own right, and the trade-off for making them slightly more rewarding by connecting them to quests is that it makes those same quests feel needlessly drawn out and repetitive. Some quests hint at wanting to do more in the gameplay department, like when one quest gives you a hand-drawn map to use to navigate. But that same quest still guides you where to go via the minimap, so it's hard to know why they even bothered with the new map. Perhaps they wanted to experiment with different gameplay but found it didn't work. Or maybe it just wasn't a priority compared to giving quests good stories. But either way, in terms of gameplay, quests feel very much the same. Exploration is also a bit disappointing. It's understandable that fundamental changes to how exploration and the minimap work might be beyond the scope of a single DLC, but the high-level enemies that limit the range of areas you can go to is a problem that should have been avoided. This doesn't remain a problem once you've progressed through the main story and leveled up a lot, but that's not the time most people want to explore. The time you most want to explore is when you first arrive, and if you do so, you'll run into enemies with a red skull above them constantly. These enemies kill you in one hit and take ages to kill, which locks off many points of interest, and this restrictive design was unneeded. All loot scales to the player's level, so high-level enemies aren't guarding good gear that might cause imbalance if obtained too early. Nor do they present more of a challenge, because even if you avoid getting hit, the time it takes to kill them just isn't realistic. They're not designed to be killed, they're designed to be avoided, but constantly running into high-level enemies that you have to avoid makes exploration frustrating, and makes it feel punishing early on in the expansion. They could have just toned down the main quest XP rewards, and had a smaller range of enemy levels. Or just make high-level enemies killable. In the second half of the main game, you could fight enemies over 10 levels higher, and they'd still take visible damage and be possible to kill. In Blood and Wine, enemies only 6 levels higher are near invincible, and there's no benefit to this change. This is a small issue, particularly if you don't explore much, or only explore later in the expansion. However, it's such an unnecessary issue that it still feels worth criticising. On the flip side, one area that has seen some much needed improvement is enemy variety. There are plenty of new enemy types in Blood and Wine. Some are quite simple to fight and some are quite annoying, but the range of enemies you face feels much more varied and slightly more challenging than in the base game. What's more, different enemies do feel like they reward different strategies, and combat can feel a bit more tactical at times as a result. And to go alongside the new enemy types, there's also mutations, which are similar to runes in Hearts of Stone but done right this time. Mutations aren't balanced especially well. Euphoria, for example, is clearly overpowered, but that's fine. A single player game doesn't need perfect balance, and the fact that mutations have a range of actually interesting and fun to use effects is more important than balance anyway. They also provide an even greater degree of customization over your build and can result in you making a playstyle that really feels like your own. Using things like Piercing Cold to blow apart groups of humans, or Metamorphosis to gain random decoctions in combat, can be very fun and also very effective if you've created a build that synergizes with them. Mutations can be really rewarding if you use them well, and overall they're a great addition that can really breathe some fresh life into a combat system you may have played hours and hours with already. Outside of combat, the second thing that feels really deserving of praise is the addition of all the smaller things Blood and Wine includes. Stuff like the upgradable house, weapons and armor racks, dyes, a new Gwent faction, Grandmaster and Manticore Witcher gear, and the improvements to the UI. Some of these might seem superfluous to some players, but what's pointless to one person can mean a lot to another. And at the very least, the amount of small things added is impressive and shows how much focus was placed on listening to fan feedback and giving players what they want. Anyway, if the worst that can be said about Blood and Wine's gameplay is that it's mostly more of the same, then for many people that means more of a good thing. And if the game hasn't evolved much, then at least there are some small improvements. And gameplay improvements are likely secondary to providing more story in many players' eyes anyway. So let's talk about that story. I want to talk about its problems, but I also want to repeat that despite these problems, it doesn't mean that the story of Blood and Wine isn't entertaining. Part of what makes it enjoyable is the setting, but there's also some great characters and great individual quests. Regis in particular is one of the highlights of the expansion. The writers have done a great job at capturing his character from the books, and the conversations between Geralt and him are some of the best in the game. Not only is Regis intelligent and charming, but there's a real believability to the way in which he probes Geralt for information and personal details. So often in RPGs, conversations revolve around what the player wants to know, where dialogue seems like the player extracting information out of NPCs rather than playing out like an actual real conversation. Regis instead does the same to Geralt. He teases out information or dances around different issues, and is always back and forth to any questions. It makes their conversations feel more realistic and more enjoyable. By the time the story is coming to a close, their friendship feels completely believable, and in many ways, Blood and Wine's main story is more Regis' story than Geralt's anyway, with the moment after Detlef's death really capturing that and offering one of the most emotionally impactful moments of the story. If part of what makes the Witcher series special is the way it captures that genuine feeling of friendship between Geralt and other characters, then this friendship with Regis displays this at its best.
So why, my friend? Why stay and risk your hide?
For you. You're in a heap of trouble, Regis. Trouble Detlef brought on. Seen you die once already. That one time was enough.
I'm not certain I know what to say.
Anna Henrietta is also a very good character. She's prideful and naive, but she also displays a good deal of competency and genuine affection for her subjects, making her character come off as balanced and likeable despite her flaws. The main story also has plenty of great quests. The tournament makes for a good introduction to life in Toussaint. The White and the House of Spoons is one of the best stories about a curse in the entire Witcher franchise, and then there's the Land of a Thousand Fables and the Unseen Elder. Both of these quests are well worth another playthrough to see the one you missed. The Unseen Elder is creepy and provides some really interesting vampire lore. The Land of a Thousand Fables is even better. It does feel a bit too obvious and a bit too easy when it comes to including references to fairy tales. It's as if the writers know this is what the players like, so they're deliberately giving as much of it as possible to them, and the result is a little too fan-servicey. But this quest is still packed with great moments, like seeing the dark fate of Longlocks, or accidentally standing on Thumbelina, and the time spent here is certainly memorable. Anyway, there is a lot to enjoy about Blood and Wine's story, and to its credit, it never really feels boring. I also think the issue of pacing is something exaggerated by some people. The story sometimes feels like a race against time, but it's not that way for its entire length, and the conflict between continuing the main quest and doing side activities is no worse than most other RPGs. But there are other problems. Really, there's two of them. The first is called Detlef and the second is called Syanna, and you can pinpoint the exact moment where the story starts going wrong. It's when these two are first on screen together. Even the way this scene is written is really bad. Detlef makes an ultimatum of 3 days before he attacks Beauclair. But why? Syanna is right there, literally in his grip. If he wants her to explain her actions, why does he fly away? Just ask her. And if he wants to kill her, well, why not do it here and now? And why does he threaten to attack Beauclair as revenge anyway? Syanna has been proven to dislike Beauclair and not care about others, so how does this threat affect her? I guess Detlef is supposed to blame all humans for her actions, for some reason, but we're still not given a reason why. Why does he blame all humans for her actions? He's been established to be smart and to be considerate when it comes to humans, but these two things seem to evaporate in an instant. Firstly, the very fact he's been fooled and manipulated so easily by Syanna feels hard to believe. He's an ancient vampire who's lived for thousands of years. You'd expect him to be wise and one of the last people to be so naive over a short romantic relationship, or to respond in such an overly emotional way. He seems less like an ancient vampire and more like an overly emotional schoolboy getting broken up with for the first time. It's dumb. And what did he see in her anyway? We don't see any actual evidence for their love, and we know she wasn't being truthful about herself either, so how did he fall so deeply in love with her in the first place? And then even if razing Beauclair to the ground did make sense as revenge against Syanna, it doesn't make sense for his character. Just a couple quests ago, we witnessed Detlef killing Count Delacroix. Here, we see Detlef is so emotionally affected by having to kill an innocent man that he cuts his own arm off afterwards in a visceral and physical manifestation of the guilt he feels at having to do this deed. And not a few hours later, he's completely okay with killing an entire city full of innocent people. He will happily commit genocide just to get a chance to talk to a person who is already in front of him, who he can already talk to if he wanted to. So this entire plot point is stupid, and the reason things play out this way seems obvious. The developers knew they wanted to have Beauclair being attacked by vampires to make for an epic finale to this story, and so the story itself and the characters were forced to fit around this. This part of the story feels contrived, because it was. And this is the exact thing Hearts of Stone felt like it completely avoided, so it's even harder to forgive here. Anyway, you then immediately skip forward 3 days, and that skip in time feels jarring. If Regis and Geralt knew they couldn't find Detlef, which Regis had said earlier, and they knew Detlef wasn't bluffing, why did they wait until Beauclair was being attacked to do something that could actually help? The player doesn't get any answer to this, we just skip forward in time. But then Beauclair gets attacked and yeah, visually it does look really good. You have burning buildings and vampires everywhere, it's very cinematic. But no matter how good it looks, it's hard to just shrug off the context behind why this is happening. And that context is kinda dumb. The final boss fight is similar. It looks great, the fight's fun, but the whole encounter doesn't have the emotional weight behind it that it's meant to, because after Detlef attacks Beauclair, you have no reason to be sympathetic to him. I mean, yes, it sucks to be broken up with, particularly when you feel you've been lied to or manipulated. We've all been there, it hurts, it's a bad thing to go through, etc. But you know what people don't usually do in that situation? They don't usually go out and try to genocide an entire city. because even if you have been broken up with, you should still realise that's kind of a dick move. So Detlef starts as an interesting character, but his characterization completely falls apart by the end of the game. And then there's Syanna, whose first problem is she's introduced way too late. She's such an important character, but the story is almost over by the time you actually meet her. And if you choose the unseen Elder path, you basically don't even interact with her. She has so little screen time that she barely exists. If you follow the other path instead, you'll at least get to spend some time with her, where the writers try as hard as they can to make her sympathetic, by telling us how much she's suffered in the past. She was ostracized as a child due to the curse of the Black Sun. She was blamed for things unfairly, she was later banished, the knights beat her on the way out of the kingdom, and so on. The writers do all they can to make her seem sympathetic, but they forget the most important part of making an audience feel sympathy for a character who has done bad things, which is showing their guilt, or regret, or desire to repent. We don't see any of this from Syanna, and as a result the audience has no reason to forgive her. She may have suffered in the past, but experiencing suffering is never enough of a justification for causing more suffering. The fact she feels pain doesn't give her the right to cause others pain. She has done something wrong, and in order to feel sympathy towards her, we need to see her feel at least some guilt over those wrong deeds. But instead of this, the game does almost the exact opposite of what's needed. In order to get the good ending and prevent Syanna from murdering Henrietta, we have to bend over backwards and do everything we can to comfort Syanna and tell her it's not her fault, all while she continues to behave the same way. We don't see her struggle against her vengeful side. We don't see any sign of guilt. Hell, we don't even see her suffer. We just hear about how hard her life was while she continues to skirt any responsibility for the suffering she herself has caused. And it doesn't help that the object of her ultimate vengeance is Henrietta, who has done nothing wrong, while displaying a large amount of compassion for others, including Syanna. So despite the game's best efforts, Syanna fails as a sympathetic character. And part of that is because it really does feel like the game is trying to make her sympathetic, like the player is being told how to feel or how to act to get the good ending. And despite that, you're still aware that what Syanna has done is morally wrong, and it doesn't feel right to just accept this and forgive her without seeing her also admit this. So between Detlef and Syanna we have two villains, both designed to be sympathetic, and neither ending up being successful. Well, at least the game lets you kill both, although to do that you have to avoid the magic ribbon, which you're quite unlikely to do on your first playthrough. In fact, the ribbon itself seems like another fairly contrived aspect of the plot, and I don't see why its inclusion was needed. The player could have just been given a direct choice to stand between Detlef and his vengeance, and having that choice may have been more satisfying for most players. In the end, you have to wonder what the point of this story is meant to be. You might consider Detlef to exist as a commentary on vampires. That through Detlef the game is trying to show how vampires are too dangerous and unpredictable, even when they mean well. But there is too much animal inside of vampires, that they are just too fundamentally different to humans, and so as a result the two species can't coexist peacefully, as disaster will always be potentially just around the corner. But that message doesn't work, because Regis counteracts it in every way. He's as far from an animal as can be and remains in complete control of himself throughout. So I guess the story is not really about vampires. But what about vengeance? Vengeance is at the heart of Syanna's motivation, and also Detlef's towards the end. Maybe the game is trying to show how flawed vengeance is as a motivation, how it never works in the long run. But that also doesn't make sense, because Syanna either gets away with everything completely consequence-free in the good ending, or she gets her revenge in the bad ending at the cost of her life, but that cost is something she's happy to pay. So what exactly is the story trying to say? That forgiveness is good and exiling children suspected of being cursed is bad? I mean, surely there's more to it than that, but I wouldn't know what. And I'm not sure the writers knew exactly what they wanted this story to be either. It almost feels like the point was simply to be entertaining. And if that's the case, it did succeed. And maybe that would be enough if it wasn't for Hearts of Stone managing to be so much more than that. Blood and Wine seemed so full of great ideas, and maybe that itself was the problem. Maybe they wanted to do too much with the story. You have 4 different central ideas here: a Witcher story about vampires, a commentary on Toussaint and its chivalric values, the Curse of the Black Sun, which involves questions of nature versus nurture, and finally a buddy detective story with your good friend Regis. All have potential and each feel inadequately explored. A story fully focused on vampires that subverts certain tropes or expectations could have been great. The best scene in the main story was probably the ending to Oriana's party, where you sit down with her, Detlef, Regis and Anarietta. The pretense behind it makes it feel dangerous and exciting in a way conversations rarely can be, and it makes me wish we had more fraternizing with higher vampires with unclear morals. Likewise, the books you find in Teshem Mutna are also really interesting. They talk about human husbandry methods, and the difference between free-range and caged humans, and it's great seeing humans placed lower down on the food chain to something else, while also making comparisons between vampires' attitude towards humans and humans' modern attitude towards animals. The comparison between vampires' desire for blood and alcoholism described by Regis is also interesting. These things show the more unique aspects of vampires in the Witcher universe, and it feels like this topic has enough potential to have been explored more in a story that was more focused and didn't feature Syanna at all. As for Syanna, the problem with another story focused on the Curse of the Black Sun is this story's already been told, twice if you include the Witcher 1 DLC, but even ignoring that, the way this curse is used in Blood and Wine is worse than in the short story The Lesser Evil in every way. Every theme explored in The Lesser Evil that involves the Curse of the Black Sun is done far better, and what's more, Blood and Wine also loses a lot of the ambiguity around the curse, which makes it less interesting. Whereas before it was left completely ambiguous, in Blood and Wine it's said that the curse causes bad dreams, which is what leads to individuals' bad behaviour. It's effectively a middle ground between the 2 previous options, that the curse was either a real thing that manifested biologically, or Geralt's opinion that there was no truth to it and it was only belief in the curse that had any effect. So not only does Blood and Wine do nothing interesting with its use of the Curse of the Black Sun, it also manages to make something previously seen in the books less interesting. A story completely about the Curse of the Black Sun could have worked, but Syanna would have needed to be introduced way earlier and been a larger focus. Then there's the chivalric values, and considering the story starts with a knight riding towards a windmill, in a very obvious Don Quixote reference, it's not unreasonable to think that the deconstruction of those chivalric values might be the main focus of the story. The use of the 5 virtues in the main questline also suggests this, but in the end, that's all we see of it. And that's a shame because there's definite potential there considering the Witcher's history of taking things seen in storybooks and providing a more cynical spin on them. Instead though, the story feels full of ideas and full of potential, but in the end it fails to deliver anything more than an entertaining adventure. And that might make Blood and Wine a disappointing expansion if it wasn't for Toussaint itself. The final thing I want to talk about is the setting, and what a setting it is. The whole of Toussaint looks incredible, but Beauclair is something else. If you haven't already, the next time you play Blood and Wine, take a couple minutes to just walk through Beauclair. Just walk through it slowly and really look at all the detail. This city is so well designed, it's insane. And it's honestly a shame how little time you actually spend here, and how little reason the game gives you to really look around this place and appreciate the high level of detail. You're always running through it to get somewhere, following the dotted line or just going from point A to point B. You never get to interact with this place in a real way. You don't need to memorize your way around, you don't need to explore the nooks and crannies. This place is just background setting, but that is a shame because it feels like so much more. It feels real. Or maybe it doesn't, because it feels too good to be real. And that's a feeling the whole of Toussaint has. This place has a magic to it. Even the already saturated colour palette of The Witcher 3 is dialed up a notch, and it really does feel like a land out of a fairy tale. Playing through Blood and Wine, you fall in love with this place, and don't want the experience to end. It feels like going on holiday. And that feeling is deliberate and has been carefully crafted. Outside of the main story, the whole of this expansion takes a far more light-hearted approach than the series ever has before. This isn't a setting dominated by war, or famine, or racist extremism. So instead it can focus on showing the good side of life, the fun, the passion, the humour. And so you have quests like A Portrait of a Witcher as a Young Man, where Geralt gets his portrait drawn, or Paper Chase, where you take a memorable trip to the bank, or Goodness Gracious Great Balls of Granite, where the player is asked the deep moral question of whether the needs of the many outweigh the erectile dysfunction of one old man. And these quests care far more about making the player smile than offering exciting gameplay or real drama. Then you have quests that provide light-hearted twists on the usual type of side quest seen in The Witcher 3. Quests like Of Shears and the Witcher I Sing, where you look for a missing person except you have a bard following along behind you, singing about what's happening the entire time. These quests are a lot of fun. The game takes the ideas of chivalry, tradition and legends, and then spends a lot of time making fun of them. The inhabitants of Toussaint come across as somewhat hopeless, but they're not just hopeless. The game also takes these same ideas and celebrates them. The idealism of Toussaint is not just an illusion waiting to come crashing down and reveal the darkness underneath. It's an idealism that's flawed, but it's also well-meaning. The knights can be foolish, but they can be brave. Romance can be exaggerated and have mixed up priorities, but it can be real and moving as well. The people of Toussaint can be naive, but they also understand that life is meant to be enjoyed. And so the people of Toussaint are easy to love despite their flaws. And really, this approach is nothing new to the series. There's always a good and bad side to the people in The Witcher. The islanders of Skellige live a hardy life with customs that can be brutal, but they also display a great deal of honesty. The downtrodden peasants of Velen can be superstitious and ignorant, but they also live hard lives and are deeply sympathetic. Elves can be hateful, but they have good reasons to be so. The Witcher always shows the good and the bad, and that people are a result of their environment. And that environment in Toussaint just so happens to be a pleasant one for a change, one where people's problems are smaller, but their passions remain just as large. The result is great. Toussaint feels different to anywhere else in The Witcher, but that difference feels strangely fitting and deserved. We've wandered through enough swamps, slain enough monsters, and been at the centre of enough important events. Maybe a place like this is where we should be. And maybe it's where Geralt should be. He seems to be treated pretty well here after all. The difference between a professional witcher and a young knight with something to prove seems somewhat smaller than you might expect, and it seems the inhabitants of Toussaint seem to agree. The open hostility and prejudice that has so commonly been displayed against Geralt doesn't seem anywhere near as common or extreme here. And if witches and monsters are both dying out, then what better place to be than a land of fairy tales? So as places go, maybe there is nowhere better than Toussaint to settle down in. A place where Geralt can still save some helpless knights on the side, but can receive real thanks for doing so. A place where Geralt always has a home to go back to. And maybe that's why it's so easy to see Corvo Bianco as a home and to imagine a future for Geralt here. Maybe this is where he belongs. In the end, it's hard not to see Blood and Wine as one huge piece of fan service. Sometimes that fan service can be very obvious, like in the quest Equine Phantoms, where Roach gains the ability to talk. Geralt is supposed to not care much about his horses and not get close to them, hence the name Roach for all of them, which the Polish version of has a secondary meaning as insignificant person. So a quest focusing on the relationship between Geralt and Roach doesn't make much sense, but the quest doesn't care. Hell, Roach even has a male voice despite being female, and the game happily points this out. We then get loads of fourth wall breaking commentary designed for the player, and people love this quest. Of course it's fan service, but it's done well enough that the fact it doesn't make much sense lore-wise hardly matters. And perhaps Blood and Wine is the way it is because of that fan-first approach, for better or for worse. Perhaps that's why the story feels like it has good ideas but no clear goal. but there was a desire to include things players like without knowing exactly how to connect them. And perhaps Syanna and Detlef exist because players enjoyed the morally grey characters of the past, like the Bloody Baron, Lefo or Olgierd, and so the writers wanted to recreate that. Maybe that desire to please fans is actually what led to the story's main issues. But that same approach might be what makes the rest of Blood and Wine so good. That it is full of small additions for the fans, that there are plenty of references to previous games, and that the game has way more content than a DLC needs to have. And maybe that's also why Blood and Wine was able to pull off being so light-hearted and full of fan service without feeling inappropriate, because this approach is consistent throughout the expansion. Blood and Wine is a send-off to both Geralt and the fans, but it was also a love letter to them. It's a fitting ending to this saga after everything Geralt and the player have went through. And why wouldn't CD Projekt want to send them off this way? They've come so far from when they first started development on The Witcher 1. From a small Polish company with everything stacked against them to being one of the biggest names in gaming. And that's a journey they took with Geralt and the fan base they built up. When it comes to saying goodbye, why wouldn't they want to give Geralt and the player a happy ending and design the entire expansion around that idea? The final conversation with Regis makes for a perfect way to bring this story to its close. What better way for this journey to end than by sitting back, enjoying a drink with a friend, and reminiscing about old times? It's the quiet moments like these that have always been at the heart of the series, and it does a good job at capturing that feeling of a journey coming to its end. And what a journey it's been.
I so don't feel like going anywhere. Sit here a while longer?
So we shall, my friend. We have witnessed, and in fact on several occasions incited, many great and weighty events. After all that toil, I believe we deserve a bit of a rest.
That we do.